Welcome back for the final time today. Welcome back. We have a couple of excellent final sessions on the possibilities for competition agencies with data technology and analytics, starting with a keynote speech. So we've heard from superstars in all sorts of different fields over the last day and a half or so, but in the field of tech economists, we now have a real superstar in the form of Susan Athey. Susan is the Economics of Technology professor at Stanford Graduate School of Business. Her research focuses on the economics of digitization, marketplace design, and the intersection of econometrics and machine learning. The list of accolades is long, and I won't go through it all. John Bates Clark Medal, membership of the National Academy of Science, and others. So is the list of board positions and advisor positions: Expedia, Rover, Turo, Ripple, the British Columbia Ministry of Forests. So with that, I'm going to introduce Susan and pass over to her for her keynote speech. Thank you.
So thanks so much for having me here today. This has been an amazing conference, and I think every panel could merit hours more discussions. But for my keynote, I was asked to talk today about the topic of this panel, the technology, data, and analytics for competition authorities. And I wanted to bring a couple of different perspectives to that. Really talk about how that's come through experiences I've had in the private sector for big and small tech companies, in academics, and in competition policy work. And I want to highlight some themes and lessons that have come up. Now, talking about that here at CMA and in the context of this conference makes me feel pretty humble, because it seems like the CMA is a leader in the world, and indeed some place that we can learn from in how to bring in new disciplines, especially data science and technologists, into competition authorities. Nonetheless, I'll try to bring in some insights that I've had from other experiences. So I want to start with the business context, and I basically, after about 12 years in academics, I started a second career in business as the consulting chief economist for Microsoft. That wasn't actually something that I was planning to do, but I was recruited, and the problems that I saw when I first stepped in the door, especially in the search engine, were so fascinating and clearly going to be so impactful that it was impossible not to get sucked into it. I think being an expert in search in the mid-2000s kind of gave you a sneak preview of pretty much all the major problems in society, democracy, and competition that we're facing today, as well as a preview for changing science. And I'll come back to that. It changed social science, the way science is done in universities, and even the way universities are organized. So it was pretty profound, and it was hard to walk away from. So when I started there, I was a lone economist, and when I came in, I couldn't have defined machine learning for you at all. I didn't know, what an AI system was, didn't know about A/B testing, and I had almost no experience in competition policy either. And that was not my main focus, although that was the main way I interacted with some folks in the audience, but that wasn't where I was spending most of my time. But to answer the questions that I was being asked, I very quickly learned within weeks that I would never get anywhere if I couldn't learn to collaborate. The first question I was asked within about 5 minutes was, what do you think about competition in search? Is it possible to have two search engines? What would it take to stay in this industry? And is competition even viable? What's the value of data? What's the value of additional users? So those were the first questions. But to get answers required a lot of pieces. Certainly part of the reason that I was there to start with and is that my economic expertise and my ability to think about strategies and come up with conceptual frameworks was really crucial to sort of organize the question, because it had so many moving parts. But very quickly, I also needed to be able to quantify things, and that's a pretty big challenge. The data is all out there, and they had at that time an internal cloud infrastructure. It was actually pretty difficult to get the data. And on the advertising platform, they hadn't really built up an analytic capability yet or a good infrastructure to do analytics. It was a brand new product, basically, and they'd been focusing on getting the lights turned on, but had not yet advanced to doing a lot of analytics. So it was tricky, and I ended up making phone calls, emails, making my way down the hierarchy till I found an engineer with no direct reports who could take her job offline for 3 days and help me get the data that I needed to start doing this analysis. And I sat with her, to get this done. And I still remember the woman very well. And so I needed to be able to, and I helped write the code. It was very low-level work in order to be able to go back and meet with the CEO, within a few weeks with answers. And that collaboration, that need to collaborate, and also the fact that you had billions of dollars at stake. Very quickly after that, they made an investment in Facebook, which I helped value. They started making offers for Yahoo. So billions of dollars at stake, but yet the thing that's blocking you from doing the analysis that you need are often data engineering, and there were real bottlenecks in the analytic capability that prevented that. But so it also required a lot of triage. And in economics, my life had been take a couple of years to write the paper. I was doing almost all of the analysis myself, delegating a little bit of coding, having the perfect model, the perfect answers, checking it 15 different ways. So trying to answer a really big question in a couple of weeks was the most terrifying experience of my life, and definitely not what I was trained for at all. But that was one of the most important things that I learned over all this time, was how to move away from the perfection, find the thing that was good enough, and often, very good, and figure out how to pull together the right people with the right capabilities to get the answers quickly. And if I had just relied on, say, the typical economics consultant from the time, it was hopeless. And I did try to rely on them, and wonderful people, but it was just that time, the capacity and the capability to work on those size data sets fluently and flexibly really wasn't there for the traditional firms. So I struggled a lot at first to figure out how to get this done and get it done quickly. And generally this theme came up over and over again in the questions that I was asked, is putting together cross-disciplinary teams. So the search engine had every kind of problem, whether it's people advertising on racist keywords, or selling illegal things, and what do you do with all these objectionable queries. So that was the early days of content moderation. And we would put together teams, and there was a woman who was a philosopher, and we'd get people from the legal team and the engineering team and the business team. And again, we had to often start with a conceptual framework, how to even think about this problem. And that was often why I was in the room, and that was really helpful. But then the second piece was, how do you translate these concerns that you're having into more precise questions? And then how did you come up with an empirical strategy to inform that with data? And the part that was always the hardest to delegate or to find people to do would be those translation pieces, the conceptual framework and translating it into operational empirical stuff. Once you've done an analysis once, then engineers, data engineers, and people with master's degrees are very well able to replicate it and carry it out and do pattern recognition. So it's often the fact that you're doing something for the first time that's tricky. And I think the social science and economics training is much stronger than engineering or even a classic data science in terms of translating a real-world question into an empirical exercise. But often the data scientists and engineers were much faster at implementing and executing once you had done that translation. So those successes led to a lot of influence for people who could be multilingual. And ultimately, I became multilingual because I was trying to do what was sometimes econometric analysis with machine learning trained people, and I needed to understand the machine learning. So I kept asking questions. It turned out I learned econometrics so much better from trying to go back and forth with machine learners, because I had to explain why I was doing what I was doing to people who were quite sure there was another way to do things that was exactly right. And that process teaches you in a way that is hard to underestimate. And so out of that, I'll come back to it, but actually I had won a lot of awards for one research agenda. I came out of it with a completely different scientific research agenda, which was dramatically more successful than anything I had done before. And it came out of that cross-disciplinary interaction. It came out of me pushing and pushing to understand, and them questioning me to solve problems they weren't able to solve. So that's, I think, the magic that can happen when you bring these disciplines together. And I tell all the young people now, that's where the shortage still is. All these universities are churning out, thousands of people trained to train neural nets and to, do basic machine learning problems like a cookbook. But we're doing a bad job teaching people how to think about questions. My students download data sets from the web, and there's like 200 data sets, and they run the same algorithm on all 200 in a loop and produce the results, because that's what you do when you're doing prediction and classification. They don't even know what the Y's and X's are. That's how we teach the thousands of people that are then going to go out and build the software that affects our society, democracy, and existence. Okay, so I'll come back to that as a problem as well, but that was clearly true in the tech firms. Who was building the code? Very well-intentioned young people, but who just hadn't been trained even how to understand exactly what they were doing fit in. Another thing there was that was very important there was just that the way that the things were organized and that everybody was working on their little problem. It was a decentralized organization. And you saw how the AI systems worked. So in a large thing like a big social media organization or a search engine, there's hundreds of teams, each of them small teams of engineers. Each of them has a metric that they optimize for. And then they innovate, and they evaluate the success using the A/B testing platform. So something goes out to users if it passes the A/B test metrics, which means that you have to boil success down to like 5 numbers or 3 numbers or sometimes 1 number that you can measure. I think, at least for a while at Facebook, they did it like as 1 number, which was a weighted average of things. So if you think about just for a second, if you had something really important and you really have to boil it down to a couple of numbers, and you're going to make 100 decisions in an hour based on those numbers, okay? First of all, it's hard to come up with those numbers. Those numbers are super important. But also, you're going to make systematic mistakes because there's no way those numbers are going to capture everything that's important. So how do you innovate quickly? You have an hour-long meeting, you look at 100 A/B test results, and you discuss 5 or 10 of them. And those are the most important meetings in a week. And every week or twice a week, you ship stuff to customers in the afternoon after looking at things in the morning. So that also, I think the economist, the statistician's perspective on that was like, oh, here's a good KPI. The economist's perspective was, you've created an incentive system. You've created an incentive system for innovation. People are only going to build one type of thing and not others. And actually, one way to change the way this ship is sailed is to change the way that you measure things. So a lot of the work that I did was trying to make that be more long-term, to try to come up with measures that better captured long-term. If you just go in the short term, you get clickbait, you get irrelevant clicks, irrelevant ads, bad matches, because that makes money in a second. But the economist often has to think about feedback effects and equilibrium effects, and the fact that advertisers will disengage, that users will get disgusted. They'll click now, but not like you later. But trying to measure those long-term effects is actually hard, really hard, even if you want to do it. And we wanted to do it. I wanted to do it, but it was still hard to execute on and implement. And ultimately, even if they do your best you can, you're still going to be short-term focused because short-term is easier to measure. So there's a trade-off between innovating quickly and innovating for what you want. And if you wait 2 years, you're dead. So we have to really be aware of how these organizations are done. But also, if you're under competition, you really care a lot about the long term, and you're more likely to work hard at it. And if you don't have competition, it's easy to be sloppy. So, you can let click fraud go on and on and on for years and years in a display advertising exchange because competitive pressure doesn't stop you from doing it. But also, probably the middle managers had more fraud than was profit maximizing. Because it was actually, it's a short-term benefit to keep it there. It's a long-term gain to get rid of it. So a lesson out of that is understanding the technology and the measurement also implies an understanding of the incentives, and they feed back into each other. Also, you can understand where the data is, where the decisions are made, who's making the decisions, and what metrics are guiding them, and what kind of analysis would be done. So those kinds of understanding that I gained, I also felt were easier to translate into the competition. One other thing I did at the time was I started Microsoft Research New England with a couple of collaborators. That was a research lab that combined social science and computer science that it later expanded to New York. They did internal research, and that was and as well as external research. But part of that laid the foundation for some of their leadership in AI ethics. And that was another, and they also brought in external academic collaborators, and we hired data scientists to facilitate that interaction. And I think that external perspective and figuring out ways for external academics to come in and help do these long-term projects or think through these thorny conceptual issues was really beneficial. Okay, so that led me afterwards in 3 parallel tracks. In the competition and regulation space, I did a lot of advocacy around search. And it really took years to educate all the different agencies, because at the beginning, people just didn't understand the tech at all. Nobody knew what A/B testing was, what machine learning was, how it was different from econometrics, how did it work, what were the business models, what were all the back-end business deals, what was the role of rankings, how did consumers respond? I was asked, how could eyeballs rolling up and down the page possibly affect anything? How could that be a real search cost? And of course, everybody in the industry knew that that was central. That's what all the R&D is about, is ranking. Like nobody doesn't think that. But yet that was something that was controversial until we ran experiments. Also, the regulators took time to realize that just getting a dump of data wasn't the only thing they could do. They could also request A/B tests and actually run live A/B tests, which I did to show the vertical manipulation. But also user tests and other things. And I think that was a time where a lot of agencies learned these new toolkits, which were really important, and they could learn from industry about how to do that. I also saw afterwards in business that after I left Microsoft, I made several changes. One of them, as I started advising startups and venture capital firms, and then eventually that evolved into board positions. And so I saw then the role of the platforms, from the perspective of the startups who were trying to raise financing, whose customer acquisition costs were a key component of getting the next round of venture capital investing. I also saw how, in 1 month, 3 firms would all have meetings to say, oh my goodness, our growth is going to be slowed because the price of clicks on Google just went up for reasons we can't understand. And we're going to cut back on R&D because, we're burning too much cash, and we need, that's the way it works in growth startups. I also saw that, especially from executive education and from, educating the rest of the industry about AI, that the hype for a long time was greater than the reality. People would talk about AI, and every bank would come in and say, how much AI is everybody else doing? We haven't really figured it out yet. And they were all worried that everybody else was ahead of them. But they were all facing the same problems. Their data was siloed in lots of different places. They hadn't actually built the infrastructure. They couldn't compete for data scientists against the big tech companies. So for a long time, it was all hype and no reality. They had a few optical character recognition projects, and that was it. One of the things that I'm seeing very recently is that actually now machine learning diffusing for real much more broadly. And a few things have happened there, and those also, I think, impact governments and universities, that the cloud computing environment has gotten much better, and tools have developed so that you're lots and lots of open source tools, which make it much easier to do analysis and to do analysis at scale. I was writing code in C# to do anything non-standard, to do different kinds of econometric models back in the late 2000s. You'd have to have whole teams of engineers just building basic statistical algorithms. Now, it's all available open source, and it's not just available, it's highly optimized, it's optimized for distributed computing. It's all these things I had to learn and think about just to do basic analysis are now completely off the shelf. The tools for data management and so on. So that as a professor at Stanford or as a small startup, you can ingest large amounts of data and analyze it without a lot of capital. I can spend tens of thousands a year to analyze, hundreds of gigabytes of data. There are still important scale economies, don't get me wrong, but it's become more of a thing in the rest of the economy as a result of this. The talent competition is also just really brutal, and that's something that, of course, agencies are going to face as well. That, any student of mine that can breathe from Stanford with an engineering degree gets, 5 job offers. Like, it's just, it's just so competitive, and the salaries have gone up, dramatically in the last year for the tech firms hiring talent. So it's just really, really difficult. I think work from home gives some new opportunities, though. So last, I want to talk about how this translated in economics. I've already hinted on some of that. First of all, I moved from an economics department to a business school. And why did I feel more at home in the business school? Where, first of all, economics is the core discipline in most business schools, and there's lots of I.O. economists in business schools, like I was, industrial organization. But in a business school, everybody is confronted daily with talking to business executives, getting pushed back on your assumptions, and getting questioned on your insights. You also bring in guest speakers from all the companies. You do exec ed. You learn what's actually happening, and the general faculty are much more fluent on how firms are thinking about things. What are their strategies? And I think that emphasis and that knowledge, institutional knowledge, is important. You also have people who study entrepreneurship, venture capital, marketing, behavioral, and all of these things actually come together, and those were all different areas that were coming together for me in my business and in my academic research. Now, my research, as I mentioned, it switched. I did some work on the impact of digitization, but I also started this agenda on machine learning and causal inference that was combining the algorithms of machine learning with the types of business and social science and regulatory questions we have, like what would happen if people raised prices? That's a causal question. And so I did research on how to bring that together. And then I also started doing a lot of these large-scale data projects in the university. But then I faced the same problem. I needed people. I needed workers. And now here in the university, I have, master's students and PhD students, but still I needed teams. I used to have one research assistant. Now a project needs multiple people. I have a project now on chatbots that has like 10 people on it. I've got a psychologist and an engineer and a designer, from all disciplines. So I created a lab called the Goal of Capital Social Impact Lab now, after the donation to fund it, and we started trying to bring this tech toolkit to the social sector, because the social sector didn't have the people to do this type of work. I had learned it all in the for-profit firms, but I wanted to take it for more social impact. It also helped solve this problem of our students who were just downloading classification data sets from the web and doing cats and dogs, but they were hungry for more. They would rather help an ed tech company in the summer than get an internship at Facebook and target ads. So this opportunity that I have all these students who want to learn something, and I have all these problems that need to be solved, was something that I tried to bring together in my lab. But I could choose to hire only one discipline, only economists, but instead I have a mix. I have political science, education, communications, engineering, statistics, all in my lab, and the people like it. It's actually an attraction to come and learn from other people on impact problems. Finally, I just want to mention, we also, in a bigger thing at Stanford, founded the Stanford Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence. And I helped found that. I've been working on it for the last 4 years. The idea there, well, there's many ideas, but some of the big ideas were that, we're not going to be able to have our ethicists and our law people and our social scientists do relevant and good research unless they actually understand the technology they're using. And our technologists and engineers aren't going to build things that are beneficial to society unless they have help evaluating the impact and even understanding and predicting its impact. So we fund big multidisciplinary for-benefit projects. We have ethical review for all of the grants. And people actually appreciate the ethical review because they don't really know how to do it if they're coming from the engineering side. We also have done other things. We've tried to address challenges for people with getting access to data and infrastructure. We have tried to do more education. I'm running a class where we have cross-functional teams where I have business students, social scientists, and engineers all in different roles on a team to work in collaboration with social impact organizations. They did projects on helping educate against misinformation using chatbots. They've helped build personalized machine learning algorithms for an ed tech platform, so kind of like Netflix algorithms, but for learning to read. And they also have to consider the ethical implications of what they're doing. And we've also created exec ed programs about artificial intelligence for policymakers, which is something I was really inspired by the importance of educating policymakers around search, 15 years earlier. So out of all of that, there's a bunch of takeaways. I just really want to highlight and reiterate that having a really deep understanding of the data, the technology, the organizations, the internal organization, the external strategic incentives is really critical for organizing good competition work in the technology age. You can triage so much better. People are always surprised when I walk in and I say, oh, well, I bet this company has this and this and this and this, and they will have done this study and that study and this study and that study. And, I'm 90% right. Once you've seen one really deeply under the hood, you can really guess how the others operate. And now I walk into all these, lots and lots of firms, and I guess right. I can always guess what problems my exec ed clients are going to have, what challenges they're having. These things are very common. So if you've gotten under the hood, you can really triage much more effectively what's going on. And this theme and really this great thing that CMA has built that we all need to try to figure out how to do our best job at is very important. We're going to need a lot of collaboration because there's big fixed costs of building stuff, and so there's not going to be enough resources to build everything. So I'm just so excited by what I've seen today, and I'm really excited for academia to be able to continue to help government and for all of these agencies to really tool up for the set of challenges that are ahead of us. Thank you.
Susan, thank you for covering such an amazing amount of ground, and luckily we get to explore it now in our final panel. So while the panel files up, I'm just going to introduce the chair of the panel, who is Mike Walker, who's our chief economist here at the CMA. Like Sarah, Mike's been part of the top team at the CMA since it started, and as a key advisor to the board. He's also an academic with positions at King's College London and College of Europe in Bruges. Mike, over to you.
Thank you. Okay, so this panel is the external perspective. What are the possibilities for competition agencies with data, technology, and analysis? We've got a fantastic panel, whom I will very quickly introduce, and then broadly speaking, we're going to run this. Each panelist is going to speak for 6, 7, 8 minutes. Hopefully, they're going to answer some of the questions that I asked them to think about. If they don't, then I'll just ask questions again in the second half. And I'm going to introduce them in the order in which they're going to speak. So, first of all, to my immediate left, we've got Julia Angwin, who is a technology journalist, founder of the Markup. Before that, she led teams at ProPublica and the Wall Street Journalist, and she's also a Pulitzer Prize winner. So we have journalistic royalty here. Then just beyond her, Frances Haugen, between Cristina and Kirsten. Frances, as you will know the name, of course, is the Facebook whistleblower. I hope you don't mind being described in that way. Who worked at Facebook amongst a number of tech companies before becoming increasingly concerned that they were putting profit before public safety, and has came out as a whistleblower. And of course, we've read the Facebook files in the Wall Street Journal. She has now testified in front of Congress and parliaments in a number of countries, and is a very impassioned advocate for how can we make social media safer. Then the next speaker will be Kirsten Edwards-Warren, who is an executive VP at Compass Lexecon, and I think deputy head at Compass Lexecon in Europe. She is a gamekeeper turned poacher because she held senior positions in the UK competition authorities before heading to Compass, so she has that perspective, been in the agency, now on the other side, and has been a professional economist for 20 years, and is on all the lists, all of the most recommended, best under far too young, that sort of thing. She's on all those lists. And then finally, Cristina, who obviously
Cristina needs no introduction.
Who is obviously very shy and retiring and very slow to offer any opinions. Who has definitely been an economic consultant for way longer than she would care to remember. But I mean, more recently, she is obviously a very outspoken critic of competition policy with respect to big tech. So it's not just a critic of big tech, because of course some of the big tech firms, she perfectly reasonably thinks are absolutely fine, but a critic of the approach of competition policy to big tech and the ensuing under-enforcement. So with no further ado, I will hand over to Julia to kick us off.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. It's a delight to be here. I was so impressed when I read Stefan's paper before coming over and seeing how much work the CMA has already been doing in collecting its own data about technology and using automation to collect information and analyze it. And that's because I, as a journalist, have devoted more than a decade of my career to just that pursuit. I grew up in Palo Alto, in the heart of Silicon Valley, and I was trained to become a computer programmer, but fell off the track for all the usual reasons that women are not in that industry, and I became a journalist. And what I found was when I entered journalism was that journalists are so outgunned, right? There are, I think, 8 to 10 PR professionals for every journalist, and also all of those PR professionals make large factors of time more money than the journalists do. And so we, as a scrappy underdog, have to use every tool at our disposal. And the thing that I realized was that journalists could be using much more automation and computation to help their investigations than they were. And so I started at the Wall Street Journal building teams that involved engineers and used their skills to help collect original data and to use that to prove things that were otherwise not that provable. And one of the things that I always say is that, like, you could sort of liken my career to at a very basic level, just trying to increase the sample size of an average journalist article from 3 anecdotes of people I interviewed at a diner to how many data points I could scrape in a month. And so I think, and not every story requires, a massive scraping operation, but I do have a real mission to increase the sample size. I think that the public has lost a lot of trust in journalism for reasons that are sometimes unfair and sometimes actually totally justified. And I think it's incumbent upon my profession to bring more data to bear to these conversations so that the readers will trust our findings. And so I want to talk about one project that I led at the Markup that I think really shows kind of the scope and ambition of what journalism could do, and honestly, what I think competition regulators could do. And this is a project that we call Citizen Browser. So basically, I was looking at this challenge of Facebook. They're out there, they say they're going to do X or Y, we're going to ban anti-vax content, we're going to ban hate speech, all these things that, of course, Francis has nicely demonstrated that they know they are not doing. But from the outside, this was before she had arrived on the scene, I was like, how can we prove that they're not doing this? Of course there are anecdotes, right? People come and say, I saw X on my feed, and this violates the content terms. But the problem was you could never really show those were systematic violations. Those just felt like one anecdote, and it'd be hard if you could try to string a few together. So what I realized was that I needed to borrow from social science. And so what I did was I put together a nationally representative panel of people who we paid to install a tool that we built that essentially monitored their Facebook feed. So they would log in, it's basically a custom browser that they would log into their Facebook account through and then never touch again. It just ran in the background. And the reason it's a browser is browsers are really good at running in the background, as you may have noticed. I don't know about you, I never close mine. But so it sits there, it runs, and it takes a little snapshot of their feed a couple times a day. And then we actually built this really intensive data pipeline to redact all possible personally identifiable information. So name, your friends' names, chat names, photos. I mean, by the time we got the remaining data, there's actually very little left on the page. But the things that were left were really important. We saw basically all the news items that were being circulated and recommendations. And so that allowed us to test two hypotheses, which is what is Facebook recommending in its recommendation systems, like recommended groups, recommended pages, and what kind of news content was it surfacing in the feed and promoting systematically. And we have a year and a half worth of reporting that shows over and over again that Facebook misrepresents what's actually happening on the platform. And I would just say that, like, I think that this is a very crazy thing for a journalistic organization to do. You know, it cost about $1 million, and we raised money for it. It's been a struggle. We're a very small little newsroom, nonprofit, and normally, as a journalist in other industries I've written about, you wouldn't do this. Like, you would, if you covered Chevron, you would go to the EPA and ask for the files on the pollution that they've emitted and when they've been fined and this and that. But because this is an unregulated industry, there's no one to go to, right? And so I sort of liken it to this idea that, you know, Facebook is like an airplane and there's no FAA, so we, the journalists, are out on the tarmac trying to inspect it while it's taxiing, you know? And so this is not an ideal situation. And so I think that I'm really excited about the fact that CMA is devoting so much effort to its own original data collection, because I do think it's really important to recognize in our technological, data-driven world that data is political. Who collects it determines what is collected. There is a reason that there is no reporting in the United States on a national level about police brutality, because no one wants to collect that data, right? And that's why the Washington Post has had to do a 7-year project personally collecting it themselves. And that's what journalists' job is, to do oversight of power. And so competition authorities also have to do oversight of power and limit that power. That is what makes democracies work. And so I think it's important in today's world to invest the time and resources to collect original data. And so I'm just thrilled to see that happening here. And I hope that somebody has extra $1 million lying around to help us fund this project.
Excellent, thank you, Francis. And we will come back to a couple of things that you've raised there, but I first of all want to sorry, Julia, head on to Francis. And in particular, I want to ask you, I mean, this conference has been fantastic, but it's been quite focused on big tech in Europe and the US and the sort of the issues that we face. Are we missing something important by just doing that, or not? Okay.
That is such a great question. So just for context for people, the number of users of, say, Facebook in the United States is only like 8 or 9% of all of its users. It's crazy. When we look at where they invest things like safety resources, though, they're overwhelmingly in English and in the United States. So in the case of operational expenses for misinformation, in 2020, they spent 87% of their misinformation budget on English, even though, you know, a very small percentage point. Actually, it's like 8 or 9% of users speak English. So it's even fewer users are in the United States. It's like 200 million of their 3.1 billion users are in the United States, or less. But the issue here is the reason why this matters. Like the reason I came forward was when we looked at that asymmetrical investment, when we look at who is most impacted by these platforms, we see that people living in the global south are bearing a huge fraction of the entire burden of these systems. That Facebook told us the only way we could be safe was by using AI to pull down the dangerous things. They were like, yes, 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 we understand our algorithms have these problems. You know, Mark Zuckerberg said publicly, engagement-based ranking, you know, the process of saying content that gets reactions is better content, is dangerous because people are drawn to extreme content. You know, parts of our brains are always scanning for danger, are more attracted to things that scare us, and so we engage with them. And as a result, these systems give the most reach to the most extreme content. Right now, the users who live in, say, African countries, in Southeast Asia, in South America, often they have no alternatives to Facebook, even for basic internet, right? That Facebook went into these countries and did something called zero rating. And the number one thing all of you can do to increase the amount of competition is get rid of zero rating or mandate that it has to be done via consortium. have the big tech companies come together and subsidize internet access more broadly. The reason for this is, I went to Harvard Business School. I'm one of those rare algorithmic people who also has an MBA. And it was like the gospel there of entrepreneurship, that the way you take on big giants, the way you become fabulously wealthy, is you come from beneath, you gain expertise on the margins, and then you come in and you eat the lunch of the legacy players. Facebook has been terrified that would happen since the day it was founded, right? That we always need to remember that companies' origin stories become their futures. Facebook became Facebook because they killed MySpace. MySpace became MySpace because they killed Friendster, right? Facebook did not invent social media. Facebook just ate the lunch of a bunch of other social media platforms because they were willing to grow more slowly. They didn't fall over like Friendster and MySpace did. Facebook knows that somewhere, someone is having more fun than they're having on Facebook. And people will find that. Like what happened with Instagram. When Facebook bought Instagram, the reason they bought it was they were monitoring what other applications were being used on people's phones, like what were people installing, because it used to be the APIs were much more fluid. It's one of these interesting things where when we open up data gets used in ways sometimes that we don't expect. And Facebook came in and said, oh my goodness, there's this app and it's growing incredibly fast. We should buy it now. And so they paid I think a little over $1 billion for about 14 employees. It's considered like one of the most profitable per employee acquisitions that's ever happened. And Facebook knows that could happen again. And TikTok is perfect proof of why what they did in response was exactly the right thing, or at least in their interests. So they went into countries all around the world and said, if you use Facebook, your data is free. But if you use anything on the open web, you're going to pay for it yourself. And as a result, even if only 30%, 40% of the users in a given country use that subsidized access, companies converge to say, no, we're not even going to have our own personal websites. Everything is going to be on Facebook. And now if you go look at the polling data, when you ask people around the world, do you use Facebook? Do you use the internet? There's a 10 percentage point difference in more of people who say, I use Facebook than people who say, I use the internet, because they're not even aware they're using the internet. So the reason why that matters to UK consumers, why it matters to consumers in all of your countries, why it really matters in the United States, is where did TikTok come from? TikTok came from the only place that Facebook couldn't play, China, right? That competition can work if it is a level playing ground. The longer we allow zero rating to continue to exist, not only will people be literally victimized, right? Like we've seen Myanmar now, which is hundreds of thousands of people dead from an ethnic violence incident fanned by Facebook's underinvestment in Burmese. There was one person in the entire company that spoke Burmese, and they ignored that person. Ethiopia, where we have hundreds of thousands that are dead that didn't have to die because of another fanned incident. They didn't even support Tigray, which is like one of the major ethnic groups that led the violence, when I left the company, right? There were no safety systems in Tigray. And now we're seeing violence being fanned in Kenya around the election, this time on TikTok. So we can't blame Facebook this time. But we're going to see these things over and over again. Making sure that we have space for alternative forms of social media to be experimented with and spring up is really, really important. And even other products, even products outside of social media, we're not going to get these new innovations coming out of the global south if we allow Facebook to run the internet there, continue to run the internet there. I really loved all your points about how we educate data scientists, but I'm running out of time. One of the things that we should talk about, I'm going to talk about tomorrow morning, but I'm happy to talk about more later, is the way we educate our students right now in data science and machine learning is actually anti-competitive. Because the way of being able to understand how to process those A/B dashboards, how to think in the incredibly multidimensional way that you need to in order to iterate on industrial machine learning, there's like maybe 10 companies in the world you can go to and really learn how to do that today, maybe less. And smaller companies don't have large enough communities of practice in order to actually be able to build their own communities or like redevelop it on their own. But that's a topic for another time.
Okay, well, I'm going to come back to you on that. Thank you very much. So we're now going to move on to Kirsten. I think, Kirsten, what I'd be interested to hear from you is, so you're in private practice, you're at Compass, have data team there and so on. How do you think a competition authority, like us, for instance, in what ways can the application of data science improve our efficiency, but also just improve the quality of the decisions that we make?
Thank you. The first thing I'm going to say is one of the points Susan made was about we need to be multilingual. And I could not agree more about that, because I think even just within the same economics team, even the same economist can sometimes prepare an economic framework, have their hypotheses to test, and then they design some analysis and they get the results, and then they realize they've assessed the wrong constraint, and that's even within the same profession. I think when you're putting together different professions to tackle a problem, there has to be a really deep understanding on both sides. We were, Compass Lexecon, I was blessed actually, because at the point in time the CMA was setting up the data science team, I was scratching my head thinking we need to do the same. And was extremely fortunate in that one of our economists had left some time before, gone to Deliveroo, and then came back saying, actually, I missed competition policy. And he's one of these rare people, Rashid, somewhere in the room, I think, who is a competition junkie and a data science junkie. So it was great because he came and said, okay, I can think of ways in which data science can really be used to support competition policy. And if you ask anyone in our data science team, how can data science be used to support competition policy, they say three things: be more efficient, be more compelling, do new things. And this applies when you're investigating tech firms, this applies when you're investigating non-tech firms, but it applies to processes as well as casework. So let me just break those down a little bit more deeply. First of all, be more efficient. Stefan gave a really nice example yesterday of his team building, I think you called it the evidence portal, which was a more efficient way for companies to submit evidence. That's a really nice way of how you take something that is something you do already. It happens already, it may happen manually, but using data science, you've made a much more efficient process. So you can make the process more efficient, but you can also make the evidence collection gathering more efficient. You can use algorithms for document extraction, you can scrape websites, and you can do analysis more efficiently. So one thing that we've done for years and years and years as economists on certain cases is want to understand what common customers certain parties have. And I can remember years and years ago sitting down and asking two research analysts to spend 2 weeks going through two parties' customer data and individually matching those customers across the two data sets. And they were sitting there saying, why have I got a master's in economics to do this? It's the most boring thing I've ever done in my life. And on litigation cases, we could spend even longer doing that. I mean, now we can just, we can do it in a couple of hours. There's still some manual process involved in assessing how accurate the algorithm was and how accurate the matching that came out of that process was, but it's much, much quicker, much more effective, and you can actually measure what the margin of error from that matching process is. So on recent cases on IBM Red Hat and on Aon Willis, which were both cases I worked on in front of, which were both commission cases, we were matching hundreds of thousands of customer names, submitted it to the commission, and could explain what we thought the margin of error was, how we tested it, a very quick piece of analysis. And I have to say, the European Commission assessed it in exactly the same way it would any other piece of economic analysis, by sending us RFIs with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of questions. But they really, really kicked the tires on it, but they were very open-minded to receiving different types of analysis that they maybe hadn't received before. I think they're receiving it much more now. So be more efficient. Second point, be more compelling. This is where I get quite excited, because I'm a very visual person, so I've always been a graphs rather than tables sort of person, and I've always struggled when I've got huge data sets to just look down the data sets and identify patterns without a pretty picture. So when Stefan put his dandelion picture on the slide yesterday and started talking about fake reviews, that was wonderful, because immediately I could see, okay, I know what he's talking about, I know what data has been collected, and I know what sort of linkages he was looking for. And I think data science has a real role to play here, because we are all human and we are all trying to understand massive, massive amounts of data and what patterns can be found in them. And to be able to do that and have a single compelling visual that enables you to look and understand what's in a massive data set is extremely important. Third, do new things. This is what I think we need to all get a bit creative and experiment a bit more. So I think there are new types of analysis. I think we would probably all agree that more evidence is better. We've experimented with some new types of evidence using natural language processing. So on the Aon-Willis merger, one of the interesting questions was about whether brokers could move easily between competitors, between firms. And so we scanned and downloaded all articles from Insurance Insider over, I can't even remember how many years, and ran NLP algorithms on it, and they're amazing. What they basically do is read every single article, identify the ones that are reporting a move by a person from one company to another, identify whether that person was a broker, because we didn't want people working for insurance companies, we were specifically looking for a broker, and identify from the text who it was, which firm they worked at, and which firm they worked to. If you imagine, that's actually extremely difficult to do because there are so many different ways to say X poached Y, Y left X to go to Z. There's so many different ways to do it, but the natural language processing can actually identify that, pulled all that information, produced a data set that just shows the people who moved from one competitor to another, and then we could summarize it all in one little Sankey graph, which was an awful lot of work that went into one little graph, but very, very compelling. And again, the Commission kicked the tires on the analysis, but it wasn't the case that they said, oh, this is totally different, we haven't seen it. They just, took the same constructive approach that they do normally. I also think outside of cases, a question that came up yesterday was, should we be doing more monitoring? And a question that came up for Tim Wu was, should authorities be doing more to understand what consumers are thinking? And I think that's something that could possibly be addressed by data science if you can look at consumer sentiment on websites, forums, Twitter, if you so want. So I don't know whether this will work, and I don't know how successful it will be, but I think we should be experimenting. I think the agencies should be doing what they can. I have to admit, at the point in time I found out a year or two ago that the CMA had a 40-person data science team, I thought, my goodness, they're throwing a lot of resource into that. Is that a bit wasteful for public service? And I'm sitting there now thinking, you're well ahead of the curve because this is what you're going to need. Mm-hmm. Data is, somebody also said yesterday, every market is a data market, and it's going to go further and further that way. And I'm completely out of time. So I will stop to be a good panelist, and you can ask me a question, I'll finish later.
Okay. Thank you. So, Cristina, in your normal shy and retiring fashion, can you answer this question?
I don't know.
I'm sure you'll...
Or another one.
Exactly. Which is, first of all, how concerned should we be about the level of asymmetric information and asymmetric understanding between the tech firms and the competition authorities? And if we should be concerned about it, I'm assuming we should, but if we should be concerned about it, what should we be doing about this?
Thank you, Mike, and thank you for this invitation. I'm delighted to be here. Let me start with an esoteric dance that very few people do, but I think is essential disclosure. As someone who works in the private sector, one needs to say who one works for. So my position is I've worked adverse to Google and Facebook, both for regulator and private parties. In the last 3 years, I've done work for Microsoft, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, News Corp, and Uber. With that out of the way, the answer is emphatically yes. Does it matter that this gap exists? Of course it does. And of course, the CMA is an outlier in this universe. But there is no question to my mind that this enormous gap that exists in skills and competencies between regulators and companies is at least in significant part responsible, I don't mean uniquely responsible, but responsible for the level of under-enforcement that we have seen, for the fact that cases take 7 years and then it takes 2 years to concoct a remedy that doesn't work, but everybody doesn't know why it doesn't work, but the company that knows it doesn't work, and we go around in this dance for another 2 years. So that gap is dramatically important, and as I say, the CMA is an outlier, but needs to be needs to be filled. Now, because we failed so dramatically to enforce, we are now pivoting towards regulation. And it is an expression that some don't like. We're not quite pivoting. We are complementing antitrust with regulation, whatever you want to call it. The problem doesn't go away because you call it regulation. There is now a set of rules which are set by the legislator in very general terms. Thou shalt not self-preference. No self-preferencing in ranking. No bundling. And when you're faced with these rules at that general level, you're totally at a loss as to what it is that you should be doing, and you need guidance. But then if you ask for guidance and you say, what is it? Is it anti-competitive self-preferencing? Because we have some guidance in competition law. We know what that means. But no, we're in a different paradigm now. We're no longer in antitrust, we're in regulation. So it's all bets are off. What should we be doing? Well, we don't know yet. Just provide your compliance report and we'll then tell you. So the gap in skills is what fundamentally motivates, and resources ultimately motivates this problem, which is very live. I want to go back to some of what Susan said, because of course, as usual, Susan is inspirational. She talked about concepts like collaboration, which she very much described as an issue when she was working inside business. And this is something which, albeit from the external position, I see as fundamental. The collaboration between the technologists, the data scientists, the engineers, and those who are at the front end, charged with delivering some sort of interface with regulator is fundamental. And yet you do not yet have enough of that. The question Susan also posed is, should we educate, should companies be involved in educating regulators? Because you can build skills and competencies as an antitrust agency by investing into it. What is the role of the companies themselves, of the targets in this game? And to me, it is something which is potentially very important, because there is a huge amount of knowledge which is there to be effectively shared. In reality, it doesn't happen for two reasons. One, because there is a certain diffidence around the idea of collaboration. I mean, Damien Girardin yesterday said, we don't want to be too collaborative with these companies because there's capture. But there's also the fundamental point that inside a company, when you know that your engineers are going to be talking potentially to a competition authority who does not have equivalent skills, you protect them. You don't bring the engineers to see the regulator, because what are they going to ask them? What's cloud? I mean, it isn't going to be a very productive discussion if at the regulator end, you're only faced by lawyers and economists who don't know their technology. So I think this is the reality we're faced with today. So how does one overcome it, briefly? I think I've always thought that in principle, if companies are doing nothing wrong, they should have incentives to share some of the data and the information that they have, because there is no better proof than to say, well, here it is. I'm not self-preferencing. I'm not doing anything like this. But reality is that you need to have some sort of incentive-compatible mechanism to induce companies to come forward and share that kind of knowledge. And there needs to be some sort of mechanism that ensures there's no fear of retribution if you are sharing that kind of information. And perhaps the way to think about it is there should be monitoring, or there should be this kind of exchange outside of a case. It should be an ongoing kind of process, which doesn't happen only in the adversarial context of a competition case. Because to me, there's no question that the industry ecosystem is incredibly well positioned to provide helpful information if the incentives are right for this to happen in a way that is not adversarial. And we should be thinking, regulators and companies should be thinking about how to set that up. And that extends to things like, one needs to be very clear also to companies. They cannot sign any kind of agreement with gags that they cannot tell a regulator if they've done a deal with someone about the implication of that. I mean, we've seen it in Jedi Blue, we've seen it in Bernanke, we see it in the Texas case, which has been exported everywhere. But I think in general, we need to facilitate information flows without concerns about retribution. Perhaps, again, the best way to do it is to somehow erect structures that allow you to have this exchange in a way that is outside of a controversial, an adversarial case. And finally, the last point I'll make is that in terms of analysis, I think what also needs to be done, and where I think, again, there can be a great deal of learning that comes through collaboration, is that where the important piece of the frontier for the required tools, it seems to me at this point, is tools to detect biases, preferences, and really provide explanation for algorithms. Because it is absolutely not going to work to just tell a company, just give us gigabytes of data. We observationally will tell if you self-preference. You know, it doesn't work. You cannot just look and ingest this data and somehow fathom that there is self-preferencing. You'll miss variables, you leave things out. So no, just let's have some discussion, some tools that can be used to examine that, and this is something that can only be done collaboratively. You cannot look at it from the outside.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to come back to that point in a bit. Can I just move on to Susan? I mean, Will at the beginning said, you know, sort of slightly throwaway remark, oh, and she's won some awards. I mean, you know, she's won the John Bates Clark Medal. I mean, in economic terms, we have a minor deity here. So, so, Susan, I mean, feel free to comment on anything you've heard, but I'd also be interested in your answer to this question, which is, yeah, it's a two-part question, but one is, given everything you talked about and we've since heard, should competition authorities be aiming to hire more people from within big tech? Easy question. Harder question, how do we do that? How can we convince these people that they have a career path within a competition authority rather than within, you know, the big tech world?
Well, I think I've seen a real change in the last, 5 to 7 years among the students about how they think about big tech. And so, there used to be sort of this cool premium that is turned into a sort of, don't want to be part of killing democracy detriment or something and generally I think the understanding of the market power and the overall power has really changed the dynamic. So now I think it's more that people will go to some of those big companies because they have the best training programs, they have the best resources. Like it's a great career training to do it for a couple of years, but people, and they want to pay back their loans, the master's students, but I think people also I'm not hearing my students say, this is my aspiration to work at some of these companies forever. And so then the question is, well, what is their alternative? So that's part of what we're trying to do in introducing students to some of these social impact firms and so on, to try to expose them to alternatives. And I think government can sort of draw on some of those same themes. I think early on, people, if they are good economists, which they may or may not be, but if they're doing their dynamic programming, other than after paying back the student debt, really early in your career, the dollars you're making in those years are less important than the skills you're building. That's how we recruit postdocs and things too. They're getting this training, which will then help them later. So if they are able to work in an interdisciplinary environment, if they're gaining the skills of not just being a cog in a wheel, funneling data into a dashboard, but they're actually helping, think about questions, and in this kind of impactful interdisciplinary environment, I think they will gain valuable skills. So I think it has to be a little bit of a human capital acquisition story and an impact story. But it's hard. I mean, it's really hard to recruit. People turn over very quickly. Partly that's part of the model that's challenging. And then I guess to respond a little bit to some of these other things, I was grateful that when I was at Microsoft that they essentially funded me to create educational materials, which I then shared broadly. And I worked with great partners at Keystone Strategy and so on who had engineers and other folks to pull that work together. But in some sense, it's a little bit, it's not optimal to rely on that. Right? Microsoft felt very good that they had nothing to hide, and so they were willing to share, and people asked them to do experiments, and they ran experiments, but that's sort of not the typical case. And so I do think hiring people who have the knowledge that themselves is beneficial. And then over time, as the knowledge diffuses in the economy, it's easier. Of course, we do need to watch out for capture. I mean, we've seen it in financial services. We've seen it in a lot of industries where the regulators become captured. But I think I think we've got a little bit of room to play right now, especially with the young people who as a group, I don't think they're very captured. Okay. They're lobbying their own employers to change most of the time. They're kind of the young people are sort of a lot that they're motivated by ideals less than careers, and that can be sometimes annoying when you're trying to get them to do something you want them to do that's not fun. But I think the young people are so motivated by ideals that it's easier to find people who aren't captured.
Okay. So, and Cristina, you talked about the importance of collaboration, and obviously Susan just touched on it in terms of capture. And Cristina, you talked about trying to make that non-adversarial. But the bottom line is, we are talking about firms which have got substantial market power, and they want to exploit that. That's why you try to generate substantial market power. And on the other side, you've got competition authorities and regulators who, we're not wild about firms exploiting their market power generally. So, in a sense, how can it not be adversarial? And I'm going to first of all ask that to you, Kirsten, since you are on that other side. You are working in the private sector. Is that a relationship that is naturally going to be adversarial, or do you think actually there is scope to make it non-adversarial, despite the fact that we do seem to have these differing incentives?
How to answer this? I think I don't work for any of the big tech companies, but I suspect with some of them it's always going to be adversarial. But I also think that one of the really important things for the data scientists and the technologists within the authority is that they're plugged into the community. Because if they're at the authority for 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, they're just going to get further and further away from what's happening in the tech companies. So if I were at the authority, I would be thinking about secondments. I would be thinking about, how the people in my team were plugged into that community in other ways. I'd be looking at the firms which are maybe similar structured, but, not the big tech companies, but the similar players or some of the older players that still have the data scientists in their teams that are a bit more amenable to coming in outside of investigations and having those conversations with you. Because what I did agree with you on, Cristina, is that if these firms have nothing to hide, they should actually get benefit from coming to talk to the authorities, because if they don't talk to you and you don't understand their business model, you're going to take a cautious approach when it comes to investigating them, always. If there's any element of uncertainty, the authority is always going to take a conservative approach. So they should, in theory, be amenable to having those conversations.
Okay, so that's quite optimistic.
I'm always optimistic.
Okay. Cristina.
When I say not adversarial, of course, if you are in the context of an investigation, there is a presumption that people are on the other side. But the point is there is such a gap in knowledge, just to be quite blunt. When you are going to talk to a regulator about cloud, and who's facing you has no idea, hasn't even read the website, frankly, in terms of what cloud is, we're not going anywhere with that. And so there's one side of it, which is, of course, regulators invest and build up skill, but the other side has got to be somewhat hearing, listening. Now, I don't think that there is a world in which, of course, the companies want to come in and discuss it, and there is a risk of capture, but that needs to be managed. Otherwise, we remain in a situation in which there is such a distance in understanding that you take 7 years to do a case with 17 RFIs and 100 questions. Yeah.
Julia and Francis.
I just want to speak in favor of adversarialness as a person who feels like that's my motto in life. But I have seen this as a technology reporter. I started writing about technology in 1996 at the San Francisco Chronicle, and have been a reporter on this topic since then. And I saw most of my colleagues, I apologize for saying this, but captured, early on, and because there was, and for such a long time, like technology journalism really only became adversarial to this industry in the past few years. And it was because they were completely snowed by the words, right? The cloud and the whatever, and we're running multiple relays and, just all of that stuff. And the only advantage I had was that I had grown up in that industry and I knew how to code. And I personally, right now, cannot code a single thing, right? Like, my literacy is very minimal. Last time I coded was in Lisp, if anyone knows what that means. Okay, so that was a long time ago. And it's just that I knew enough to not be snowed. That's really all I knew. And that allowed me to be more skeptical and ask tougher questions and bring in experts when I needed them. And I will just tell you that I, as a journalist, for sure, was way more underfunded and under-resourced than any competition authority, okay? And I would just like to say that if I could scrap and scrounge at the Wall Street Journal, I stole programmers from the graphics desk and, found grad students to do things for me, that it's not impossible to do an adversarial examination. I do want to take one issue with something Cristina said. I was worried we weren't going to fight on this panel, but luckily you provided me with a nice lift, which is about the explainability of algorithms. I do not agree.
So can I just interrupt?
Yes.
Because I want to come to that immediately after Francis.
But I have so much to say on it. Yes.
I gathered that when I made a throwaway comment in the green room. But I think Francis wanted to come in on the capture point, I think it was.
So one of the things I learned a phrase from you today. Was it game ranger becomes the poacher? What was the phrase?
The gamekeeper becomes the poacher.
Yes, the gamekeeper becomes the poacher. Yeah. I think we should also remember there's like the flip one, which is like there's a lot of people who work in tech who go in there because they have limitations on their lives, right? Like being 21 years old and having $150,000, $175,000 of debt is a really scary thing. If you come from a family that made $60,000, $100,000 a year, right? And these students go in there and they often experience trauma, right? Like seeing things that you believe are wrong and having to go along with them or having to stay quiet is really hard. And one of the things I always try to remind people is you can run targeted ads on those employees, right? LinkedIn is real, right? Like LinkedIn ads work, or like, you can do ads in other places. There's a lot of people who want to do something different, or they want to be able to contribute. And I always talk about the idea that there is a continuum of whistleblowing, that we have a very distorted concept of whistleblowing because you see me, you don't see all the people who were much more subtle. And so even though there are 100 times as many people who did something more subtle than what I did, but still something meaningful, we don't have the right cultural norms. So investing together in this idea of how do we spread the idea that there's a lot of different ways that you can tip off the competition authority, the FTC, various other people is really important. And then the last thing I was going to say was on doing a lot with a little, like scraping up resources. Thinking creatively about harnessing resources, there's a lot of incredibly good coders internationally that are incredibly high quality, but they're just not priced into the market. And so remember, having international and distributed teams, you can get a lot done for a very affordable amount of money. So thinking more broadly in terms of those efforts.
Excellent. Julia, do you have anything to say on algorithms?
I do. Thank you for
Fantastic.
asking. Thank you for asking. So I feel very strongly about this particular issue because I've been really adversarially auditing algorithms from the outside for years now. And I hear a lot of talk from particularly the companies that make these algorithms that those algorithms are their trade secrets. You can't ask to look at them. It would be giving away the jewels, and therefore can't be audited. And I will just say I've never seen one of those algorithms, and I've done all my auditing, and it's been fairly significant. And I think and I want to tell like one or two stories on that. So Cristina mentioned, and I'm sorry, I'm going to take issue with the self-preferencing. I know, I'm excited for this. The self-preferencing, right, is a question that is, it's a legislative question right now, a regulatory question. How much are the platforms advantaging themselves when they're both a player on the marketplace and the marketplace owner? And so I've tackled this question multiple times in my reporting and at the Markup with other reporters taking the lead on it. And I've never seen on any of those what the algorithm is. And in fact, if you ask those companies, how does Google search ranking work? They can't answer, right? It's a machine learning algorithm that at any moment in time, they can't tell you what all the factors are. And so asking that question is the wrong question. But what I have always done is just audited the outputs, right? Take a snapshot of all the outputs. So we did this with Google search, just scraped thousands and thousands of search results, and then literally measured how much room on the page did the Google ones take up versus the others. And, big shocker, it was about almost 50%. And so that's a lot. And by the way, it was all weighted towards the top, right? That 50% wasn't not evenly distributed through the page. And similarly, we did an even more sophisticated analysis with Amazon, because it was really confusing to figure out how to measure the real estate, because the Amazon search results go across, like in those little squares. And so instead of measuring the page, and we were having struggles with what was the top result, we decided to limit our analysis to just the first result. Because sometimes, one of the things I believe strongly is you do have to, as a journalist, we're the first draft of history. We're not attempting to be the final draft. And so we have the luxury of doing, better than 3 people in a diner, but not as good as peer-reviewed IRB-approved paper. And so we took that first result, and then we actually used machine learning to analyze it. We used a decision tree to say, if you built a prediction model to predict what would be in that first spot based on the 15,000 searches we have, what would that model say? And the model said that the most important factor to get to that top result, by a factor of 8 to 1, was being an Amazon brand. Right? It was like no competition with stars and reviews. And so that is how you do an audit from the outside. Now, there may be multiple reasons why that was true, and I'm sure that Amazon will go into the regulators and tell them that, but it's still an important finding of on-the-ground truth.
Sure. Christina, I think
I don't disagree with you in terms of a screening tool. You want to do that as a screen, and put it in the public domain and raise questions and get the regulator interested? Absolutely. But then I don't think that's the end of the matter, because no one can rely on data which is being scraped and analyzed in that way for coming to a final decision. The regulator is in a position to ask more and detailed and appropriate questions. And the question cannot be, give me a ton of data and observationally I can infer if there was some self-preferencing. No, just show me in a secure environment, how do you come up with this recommendation? What is the algorithm that's behind it? You can't tell. The company does, and the regulator can have a dialogue about it. So my point is that the European Commission spent 2 years looking at the data set and came up with a view. Is that the best way to do it? To ingest this enormous amount of data and just kind of scratch your head and say, well, we're going to be trying to predict through this and that. You leave out variables, omitted variables. This stuff isn't definitive. You need to have a discussion about, in a secure environment, what it is that you're optimizing for. If you have those results at the top, what it is that you're optimizing for, why do they come out? Are you putting a sum on the scales when they come out? If so, show me. If not, show me.
So I want to be really clear. There's been an evolution over the last 20 years of like how we write algorithms. So if you had been on search in the mid-2000s, because I was on search in the mid-2000s too, we could tell you exactly how important being an Amazon brand was, because there was literally a list of factors and a list of weights and an equation where I could hand over the equation to you. That was totally true and the norm even at Google until 2014. But we need to remember that we are now in the era of neural nets. So like what she described there of a decision tree. Decision trees were the early way we did machine learning, where we had like little factors and weights and would go down a little tree and tell you what to do at the end. But we need to just be honest here, which is they can tell you what data they fed into the neural net. They can tell you how they trained it. They can tell you if there's twiddles, like things that put things in at the end, like maybe they inserted their own product in at the end. But they're not necessarily going to tell you, after they heaped this huge thing of data into the neural net, what the neural net did, because they don't even understand the neural net. So just as long as we're honest on the difference between those things.
Susan, I think you wanted to come in.
Yeah, so these are long conversations. Like I've sat in entire days on explainability and interpretability and AI and everything. Just a few things to layer on to what's been said already. in general, maybe to restate what Francis just said, like there's kind of a black box algorithm which really can only be analyzed. You can't just look at how it's constructed. Even a decision tree, it splits on one variable, but it might have all gotten the same answer if it had split on a different variable. Yeah. So I teach my students not to do that kind of model inspection, that it gives you misleading answers. But for some of the things, there still is kind of a thumb on the scale, because, say, for Google to get the result it wants, it has to do something afterwards. And so that is factual. And by the way, lots of people know that, getting back to Francis's point. Like, these are distributed systems, and lots of people touch them. So that knowledge is there. It's gettable probably even without subpoena authority, but it's certainly gettable with it. But you can also audit. On behalf of the European Commission, I ran randomized controlled experiments on re-ranking. Early on, as I mentioned earlier, people didn't actually believe that the ranking mattered that much. The reason they didn't find the observational data credible was that you don't know why the thing on top got more clicks than the thing in the second position. Yeah. It could be that all of Google's stuff is just better. And if you put it in the third position, it would still get a lot of clicks. So the gold standard answer to that is to run a randomized controlled test where you flip the results. And instead of taking 2 years to analyze, it did take us, like, I think, 6 weeks to run the experiment, because we had to get approval, because it was actually making the user experience worse. So we don't do that very often, but we did it for the European Commission, because they asked nicely. And this, by the way, Microsoft wasn't being investigated at the time. They were a complainant. But so you did the experiment, and then after that, the results are 100% clear, because it was a randomized controlled experiment, and then you don't have to spend 2 years to analyze the data. And this actually relates back to a competition point. As a remedy, just giving people historical data, it's sort of useful. It's certainly useful for finding representations of what's going on, but it's not as useful as being able to run live experiments on users, because you can very quickly get answers that take you a day to analyze instead of months to analyze, and you still don't know what it means at the end. So I guess I think of all these things as complements. I did exactly what you suggested first. Like, we looked at the observational data, because you could do that in an hour and see what was getting done, what was getting ranked where, scrape pages, et cetera. You can do that very quickly. But then to get the definitive evidence, instead of having to have experts argue and bill millions of dollars to the clients to get this done, you run an experiment and then get a very definitive answer. So I think we should be, but you can do that. And we should do more of it. If a question is really central to a case, then you can use some of these other tools.
At least
30 seconds.
Very quick thing. At least for the really, really big players, we're talking like Google, probably Microsoft, a couple of the others, they likely have run ablation experiments historically, where they'll just like knock out factors and just see how the system works. And so they might even have that data laying around on the relative importance. But it's not like they intended it, it's more of an after the fact, like understanding it.
Okay, so I'm under strict instructions to make sure we finish on time. So thank you very much. I'm going to take two things away from this panel. One, that actually there's way more agreement about algorithms than I thought we were going to get. But algorithms really matter, and how we deal with them really matter. And then the second thing, which is more of a surprise to me, is the importance of how can we free ride on the education that big tech provides to data scientists, and how effectively can we make that a public good without the commensurate capture problems. But on that, I will say thank you very much to a fantastic panel.
Thank you.